What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Like Stars podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Pete Goodman, walking through some of the questions that you guys have sent in about faith, Christianity, the scriptures, all that good stuff. We've got some fun ones today, including questions about conspiracy theories, overcoming sin. Just some good stuff, different things we're going to walk through. Please, as you're watching, as I always say, make sure if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, whether on YouTube or Apple or Spotify, please do so. Make sure you're liking, sharing, all those kind of fun things that just help other people find it. Really appreciate all of that. I was excited because on the last episode, the audio podcast crossed 2,000 downloads, which is pretty cool. I was like, wow, it's fun to see you guys listening, watching, and even more on YouTube, but it's really been encouraging. So thank you everybody who's been listening, who's been sharing it and subscribing and all those kind of things. It's really been great. Today's sponsor of the Like Stars podcast is a very special one. I would like to dedicate this entire episode to those kids on YouTube who make millions of dollars recording themselves opening and playing with toys so other kids can watch them play with their toys. Look, I just gotta say, I'm not a hater. Okay. Get yours, whatever. If you can get people to pay you money to open toys to play with, and they can then watch you play with toys, I say, hey, go for it. That might be the single greatest con job in the history of kids scamming other kids. In fact, I'm thinking about actually getting in on this action. And so I'm going to be releasing an entirely brand new podcast along with this one called Like Scams, where I'll be asking all of you to pay me money to listen and watch me do really random things like crossword puzzles. It's going to be fantastic. Trust me, the audio on that, you'll never forget it. Because I like making money doing nothing too. America, what a wonderful place. But genius kid who came up with this idea, I salute you. You are the sponsor of today's Like Stars podcast and of the forthcoming first episode of the Like Scams podcast due out in a few weeks. Okay. Let me dive into this week's first question. And I don't want to say it's related, but I don't know. I had a good friend of mine reached out, asked me a couple questions, and one of them had to do with conspiracy theories. And he kind of jokingly asked me about a conspiracy theory. And it just kind of got me thinking. So what do you think about conspiracy theories? What does the Bible have to say? What's a Christian response to conspiracy theories? We'll just call it like that. And this one kind of got me thinking a little bit. And I was like, that'd be a fun one to address on the podcast. First, I don't know if you knew this or not, but the Bible actually does speak into conspiracy theories. There literally is a verse in the Bible about this issue. It comes from the book of Isaiah, the prophet, and he's speaking to the Jewish people as they're facing potential destruction from the Assyrian army. And he says this in chapter 8, verse 12. He says, "Do not call conspiracy everything this people calls a conspiracy." Like, don't agree with all these people are saying conspiracies. Don't call everything conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear and do not dread it. So right there, I mean, what do you need? We got the Bible saying, don't call everything a conspiracy. Now, okay, let me just pause and take a small step back. I don't actually think that when Isaiah wrote that down, that he was quite thinking maybe what you and I think of today when we think of, Area 51's hiding aliens, the government secretly poisoning us through chemicals in the air, and COVID was all a plot to take over the world. I don't think that's quite what Isaiah was thinking. In fact, the Hebrew word, because that was an Old Testament passage, the Hebrew word can actually mean an alliance between nations. And so what he's probably referring to in that passage is, at that moment, the people were, scared because they knew that the Assyrian Empire was encroaching in on them and conquering nations around them, making alliances with other nations, getting stronger and stronger. And there was this looming sense of dread or fear that the Assyrians were soon going to conquer them. And so when he says, don't call conspiracy everything people call conspiracy, it probably wasn't like, don't agree with every random crazy thing in the internet. The internet didn't exist. But necessarily like, don't believe everything you're hearing, but that is part of it. So I don't want to like take a passage completely out of context and just make it mean something it doesn't mean. I kind of do that jokingly, but I do actually think that part of what Isaiah is saying here is helpful for us. That, maybe he doesn't mean don't believe that the Illuminati's pulling all the strings behind the scenes. But I think there's a similar principle that he's getting at. And there are two things about this passage that I actually think are helpful. And I just want to talk about briefly when we talk about wisdom. And the first is this. I like this line, do not fear what they fear, and do not call conspiracy what they call conspiracy. So there's two things I want to point out. The first is, I do think that there's something here about Isaiah saying, don't be so quick to jump on board with all these people talking weird stuff. I really do think that if Isaiah was today and alive at this moment, and he saw the way that we just believe everything we read on the internet, he'd be like, please stop doing that. Don't just assume everything. And look how scared they're all getting, and don't buy into that. But more importantly, and this is actually the really key to this passage, it's not even about conspiracy. It's that last statement of do not fear what they fear. Isaiah doesn't say don't fear anything. He's not saying don't be afraid of the Assyrian army. Quite the opposite. In fact, Isaiah is telling them, oh, the Assyrian army is going to come and destroy all of you. Oh, thanks, man. The issue for Isaiah is that they were scared of the wrong thing. Now get this. Isaiah is saying what you should have been afraid of, what you should fear, what should make you make you uncomfortable and quake a little bit and be like, and uneasy, is the one who is sending the Assyrians against you. You're so afraid of this foreign army and their king who's going to come and, conquer you. But you should be afraid. What you should have been afraid of is why they're coming to conquer you. And for Isaiah, the whole message is the reason this is happening is because you didn't fear God. And by fear, it's not like a shaking, trembling, like, oh my God, it's more of like a respect, an honor of a king. He is the one, but also, there is a little bit of more traditional fear here because he's saying, when you chose to ignore God, when you chose to enter this agreement, which the Jewish people did with God, and say, we're going to obey you, we're going to do everything you say, and then you just threw it out the window and said, I don't care what he has to say, you should have had more fear than that. Like, you should have had fear inside that said, wait, there are consequences if I do this. That's what you should have been afraid of. At this point, with the Assyrians marching down, it's already too late. You've already missed the boat here. You should have been afraid of God in the sense that you should have been afraid of the consequences enough to avoid even getting to this place to begin with. And so you fear the wrong thing. So Isaiah is basically saying all these conspiracy theories about, how they're going to come and do. He's like, you've already missed the boat. This is all happening because you didn't fear God. You put your focus on the wrong thing. You wouldn't have to have any fear of the Assyrians had you instead first feared God and obeyed him and stayed faithful to him. This would have never happened. So that's at the heart of Isaiah's statement. And I think there's something very important about that, that we actually might come back to in another question here in a minute. But staying with conspiracies a little bit, I want to touch on this because there is something about this, even sort of jokingly, half jokingly, but also kind of something to it, about the problem with maybe being somebody that gets too into conspiracy theories. So if you're watching this, and honestly, a lot of YouTube people, maybe that's their, whatever. Please, I'm not saying any of this to step on anybody's toes or make you feel bad or anything like that, but just hear me out on this. First, there's a couple of problems with conspiracy theories and the idea of being obsessed with them. The first is just this is just me and you can disagree. I don't even think most conspiracy theories are that realistic. Look, the idea that there's this massive government plot, I don't trust the government to fix the potholes in front of my street, much less have some secret strategy for world domination. All right. Have you met people that work for the government? Not that impressed. First of all, and most big companies, they're out. All big companies are out for money. That's nothing new. I don't know. Another thing is any conspiracy theory that was actually big enough to impact my life would involve way too many people to ever keep it quiet. Like, I don't buy it. Like, people don't keep secrets very well, especially to me, it's already like, okay. I'm already a bit of a pessimist about it. But there's something that's on the surface. Let's go a little bit deeper. I think the more important, two more important things. And the second here I'm saying is this. Part of the problem with conspiracy theories, even if somewhat true, let's put that aside. At the heart of this whole idea of being a conspiracy theorist is this propensity to always be looking for someone to blame. It's always looking for an enemy, which humans just do so naturally. It's like hardwired into us to look for enemies, to find the people who are at fault, to blame somebody, to take the problems of the world, to take all the things that are going on, and put it on the Illuminati, right? Or the secret government conspiracies, or the people in Area 51, or all that kind of stuff. And in some ways, and I think I just want to highlight this because conspiracies can actually give us a sense of comfort. Because we can sort of like, even though it's like, oh, what are out there doing? It gives us this opportunity to make sense of the problems and the brokenness. And we can say, oh, it's them. They're out there. And oftentimes when people get super obsessed and dive in, I can find all the experience, they're trying to find control in their heart. They're trying to make sense of a world that they're uncomfortable with and struggling in, and finding those people, the secret ones behind the curtain that are making all this bad stuff happen. But when fear and mistrust and questioning and doubting and making enemies of other people is your baseline and what consumes you, you're already losing. Like, you're already losing the battle. Because mistrust is unhealthy. And I know someone say like, oh, Pete, you're being Pollyanna. Like, look, I am a pessimist. Okay. Like, no one will ever accuse me of being an easily fooled optimist kind of person. But I've realized like there's something unhealthy about always looking for the dark side, looking for someone to blame. And I think this really came to the surface during COVID, because life was so hard for so many people. It was so difficult, and everything was falling apart. We're stuck in our houses. We were losing money. People were losing their jobs. It was just, our kids weren't in school, and you want a sense of control. You want to feel like you can make sense of all the problems. And so we find people to blame. Oh, it was Dr. Fauci, or it was the secret government lab. This is actually a conspiracy to reign. It's like, we're just trying to make sense of something that you can't make sense of. That we live in a broken world full of sin and full of brokenness. And sometimes the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. And it's like, rather than trying to find someone to blame, we just step back and say, God, I'm going to continue to trust you either way. And I think there's something healthy about that. Because even during COVID, the reality is, guys, I know, and some of you are going to be mad about this. Some of you might even post, oh, what about this on this secret website? Most of the people that you're turning into conspiracies were just people trying to do their best. Maybe they were wrong. I'm not saying they were all right. There were a lot of dumb things that were done during COVID, okay? But even when people were doing things that I thought was kind of dumb and didn't make sense, in the back of my head, I still chose to believe, for the most part, that those people were just doing what they thought was right. Like, they weren't actually out to make my life worse or make your life worse. And that's a very different way of looking at it. And so this brings up my third point, which I've kind of touched on. So number one, I don't think they're possible. Number two, I just think we need to be careful looking for enemies. But number three, there's something problematic about spending so much of your life focusing on the bad. And, are people doing bad things out there? Absolutely. Are there people out there trying to take advantage of you? Yeah. Are there people who probably would hurt you for their gain? Yes. Are there people who just seem to be inherently evil? And yes. Is there brokenness? Of course there's brokenness in the world. But spending all of your life looking for this evil hidden behind every rock is counterproductive for you as a person. And here I think we're getting into wisdom, because wisdom isn't, you remember what I've talked about many times, wisdom is the idea that I want to find the best life, the life that God created me for. And that means, and just hear me on this, please. You might be like, oh, you don't know, this conspiracy is probably true. Who cares? Is your life better because you've spent so much time researching it? Are you happier? Are you healthier? You sleep better at night? Paul says this. He tells us in Philippians 4 that we are to rejoice always. And that's such an interesting statement, right? Rejoice always. Why do you tell me to rejoice always? I can't make myself rejoice. He's like, well, actually you can. Watch this. Make a decision to fix your eyes, to focus on, to look at whatever is lovely admirable, true, noble, right, pure, anything excellent, anything worthy of praise, think about such things. And you may be like, well, so I'm just going to ignore all the evil in the world? Man, sometimes. Now, ignore doesn't mean don't care about. It doesn't mean if I have the opportunity to do something about it, I don't do something about it. But there was a whole season, especially during COVID in my own personal life, where I was waking up every morning, opening up my phone and looking at the news, and I was just a wreck inside in my heart, my mind. And it's like, there's always somebody doing something dumb, and who's out to get me, and who's yada, yada, yada. And then here's Paul saying, you can actually choose what you're going to focus your mind and your time on. And trolling the internet and filling your brain with all the possible things that other people might be doing wrong and all the conspiracies out there and who might be doing this, it's not actually making your life better. I would really challenge you to tell me how you are happier and healthier, you're a better spouse or parent or whatever. What if you do uncover a secret Illuminati plot? Then what? Now do you have inner peace? Now are you a person that loves your neighbor better? It's unfruitful. And so, Paul will even talk I'm going to say First Timothy and maybe Titus again. He's giving direction to what to look for in church leaders. And one of the things he calls them to is to say, your church leaders should be people that don't waste their time with pointless arguments, arguing over things that don't matter and rumors. And I think it's not just for leaders, it's for all. Why? Why shouldn't we do that? Because it's unproductive. It doesn't lead to anything good, and it doesn't lead to anything good in you. So I think wisdom tells us that sometimes we just need to guard how much stuff we're willing to bring into our minds. How much is it our responsibility to root out and really to say, like, well, I know what I'm called to do, which is to be the best husband I can be, the best father, the best pastor, make a difference in the world where I'm at. And I don't need to fill my mind with every bad thing that's going on in the world. And I don't need to look for every conspiracy and figure out everything, the secret. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And you might hear that and say, well, Pete, if nobody looks for them, then they'll win. I don't know what to say to that. Maybe God has called you to be the one to figure it out, but I doubt it. So is it beneficial? Is it helpful? Is it bringing about good in your life? If not, stop wasting your time. Now, I want to move from that to another question. That one was maybe a bit sillier. This one was a bit more serious, although I guess my answer to that got a little serious. I had a question come in, and it was more of a discussion. And the question, and I'm going to rephrase it to make it simple, was basically this. What advice would you give, or what do you say to someone struggling to overcome habitual sin or a habitual sin pattern in their life? Essentially, there's this issue. And now sin, we all have broken it, but someone's saying there's just this thing I keep being tripped up on. I'll be honest and say in the context of the conversation, it was related to like sexual stuff, lust, things like that. But the question, I think, pertains to a lot of different things. Many of you listening would say, man, there's just this one thing that keeps. And what people find, and when I say people, I mean humans, including myself, so maybe you can relate to this, is sometimes there are things in our lives as followers of Jesus that we know, like, this isn't what God wants for me. And we're like, okay, I'm going to stop doing that. And we just kind of stop. And it's like, done. But then there are other things. It's like, I know I don't want to do this, but it just keeps coming up. And every time I feel like I've dealt with it, it comes up again. And maybe you have one of those issues in your life. And I know it's true of me, where you feel like you're playing that whack-a-mole game at Chuck E. Cheese, where it's like, wham, you hit one, then it pops up. You keep trying to knock the thing down. Every time you hit one up, another one pops up. You're like, oh, I hate this game. And it feels like there are certain sins in our lives or unhealthy behaviors that just keep popping up. What advice would you give to people to deal with them? Now, I've been a pastor now for off and on different ways for about 22, 23 years. And I've gotten a question like this a lot. And I've wrestled with this question a lot in my own life. And so it's not a question of, is this sin? Those are more theological questions. We're not talking about, is this sin? We're talking about, no, I acknowledge that this isn't good. I don't want to do this. but I'm struggling to find ways to overcome it. What advice do you give? If you're hearing this and you're someone that wrestles with that, please know that I don't have a magic bullet for you. I really don't. I don't have a pill that you can take and boom, no more problems. And wisdom doesn't work that way. Wisdom gives us guidance. Wisdom is a lamp to our feet so we can see the next step ahead of us. And sometimes with dealing with stuff like this, it requires a few steps. But I want to give you what I said to this person and a few thoughts that I have brought into my own life when trying to deal with these kinds of things, these things that I just struggle to get over. Let me start here. I'll give you 3 things. And the first is this: don't ever let yourself lose sight of the consequences. And that comes back to the last point I was just talking about Isaiah and the Assyrian army. When Isaiah said, you're fearing the wrong thing. You're so afraid of the Assyrians, you stopped being afraid of God who called you to something. When somebody talks to me about this issue, any issue like this, like there's this sin thing, there's this thing I know it's wrong and I want to overcome it, but I'm struggling, help me overcome it. One of my first responses, almost always when I talk to someone like that, is, first of all, you're in a good place. Because as long as you're recognizing that this is a problem that needs to be fought, as long as you're recognizing this is a battle that needs to be fought, you're headed in the right direction. Where you don't want to be is where you've lost sight of consequences and you've lost sight of the fact that, yes, this is actually sin. You look at the book of Jude, a very short little New Testament book, and what you see is that Jude is writing to the church and saying, there are people among you who are saying, you know what? Jesus loves you. Jesus died for you. Just do whatever you want. God loves you. He'll forgive you. You can sin. You can have sex with anybody you want. Come on, don't be so prudish. And Jude's like, don't listen to them. They're liars. They're heretics. God's going to punish them. And the reason is because there's something very important and powerful there where it's saying the reason why you were saved is to bring about a new and better life. And these kinds of behaviors are destructive. These kinds of things, these sin patterns are the things that have broken us and ruined us. So don't use God's grace as a license to keep staying in them. Keep fighting, keep understanding, keep saying, God, if you've said this is unhealthy and bad for me, I believe it and I'm going to strive to overcome it. So in that sense, when I say keep your eyes on the consequences, I'm not just saying like the punishments. I'm saying like, keep reminding yourself that the ultimate end of these behaviors is not good for you. And don't ever let yourself lose sight of that. Like, this is not going to be good for me. I've kind of used a dumb analogy in the past and I'll use it here. I remember when I was couldn't even drive yet. I was like 15. I was walking to school and I was walking along like the curb of the road. And I had a police officer pull me over and give me a ticket for walking in the road. I remember being so angry about that. And I remember arguing with him. I was 15. I'm like, what's so bad? I'm walking on a curb. He's like, well, you could fall into the road and get hit by a car. I'm like, there's no cars, whatever. But that stuck with me because it's so silly to think that it's dangerous for me to walk on the curb of a road, that if I fall, I'm going to fall like 9 inches onto the road. And so I'm fine. I don't feel any danger. It seems dumb to say that's dangerous. The consequences are small. But would I have the same cavalier attitude walking on the edge of the Empire State Building, where one slip means I'm going to splat on the ground and die? No, right? I'd be like, oh, no. And so consequences, what is the risk? What is actually at stake here? When I keep that in view, it actually does something to us. When you constantly think, because our brains are constantly weighing the pros and the cons. And what happens with temptation is temptation comes in and says, it's not that bad. The consequences aren't that bad. The benefits outweigh. Okay, I'll do it. Keep the consequences in mind. Keep telling yourself the truth, which is this is not going to be good for me. Keep reminding yourself of the potential damage to your marriages and your future relationships if you let things like pornography and sexual immorality ruin your life. Keep reminding yourself the way that addiction to drugs and alcohol and these things that some of you keep wanting to go back to bring about all the damage that you're seeing that aren't healthy for you, right? Keep the consequences in front of you. And when you look at that little edge, right, and you're like tempted to go walk on it, instead of being like, well, it's only 9 inches to the road. No, it's a 40 floor drop to my death. And that is a big deal, right? In your marriage, in your life, how your children will be affected by it. Keep the consequences in view. As Isaiah said, don't fear the wrong thing. Fear God, like that there are real consequences to walking away from what he's called you to do. And remember that there are always consequences. And God forgives, but consequences are real. You can overcome and you can still be used by God. King David sinned horribly and God forgave him and let him still be king. But you know what? He paid for that sin the rest of his life, and his kids murdered each other. And I mean, there's always consequences to our sin. Don't lose sight of them. So the fact that you're sitting there saying, how do I overcome this, is a good thing. Keep asking yourself that. Keep wanting to overcome it. Don't let that go. Don't tire of wanting to overcome sin. Okay. I think that's the first thing. Second point, this builds on it, the same thing. Second thing, when you come and say that to me, again, you're in a good place, because keeping it all inside is one of the worst things you can do. We think we're alone often in these sin patterns, and then we act like it, and we keep it all inside, we hide it, and it creates this massive echo chamber where we're all struggling, but no one wants to admit it to each other. Everyone feels like they're the only one. But sometimes it just takes one person to admit, like, hey, I'm dealing with this. Like, oh man, I am too, or I used to, right? And like, and sometimes confession, repentance, in the sense of like, I need help here. I'm struggling. This is an issue. Just getting it out in the open, sometimes the most important thing, of being honest about it, bringing it into the light. The Gospel of John and the letters of John, the Apostle John in general, he loves this idea of the light and the dark. For him, truth is in the light because you can see, because I see what's around me. I can't hide when I'm in truth. But in darkness, I can hide in the corner. No one can see me. I can keep doing what I'm doing. When you bring things to light, it becomes much harder. So keep the consequences in view, and then also be willing to admit it. There's a lot of deep rooted things in our lives that need some other people. It needs some help. It needs guidance and maybe some counseling and walking with people and working with people. That can't happen unless you're willing to be open about it and tell someone and talk about it. So keep the consequences in view and be willing to share, to be open. Don't keep it all inside. It's unhealthy. Now, let me give you one more. I know this is going long, but I think this is an important question for a lot of people. There's this like assumption that exists at the heart of this question. And the assumption is something like this: I want to defeat this and bury it in the ground and be done with it. I want to win. How do I win? How do I win? Now, let me just say, and I don't want to undermine the power of God or his spirit or anything like that. All right. So there are some things in my life that I have, quote unquote, defeated, or like don't struggle with anymore. But there are a lot more things that I think I'm going to take to my grave with me. I'm not super familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous, but I know enough to know that one of the key premises of the ministry of that whole organization is constantly admitting, this is who I am. I have a problem. That it's not so much about a complete removal of the problem, but about this is how I'm going to deal with it in my life. And I think for a lot of us, what we want to do is we want to have a surgeon cut it out of us and move on and never have to deal with it again. But there are a lot of sin patterns that are so ingrained in us as people and living in a broken world that trying to get it cut out of you or just overcome it forever isn't realistic. Even saying, how do I win this battle? How do I defeat this enemy? Sometimes there's a different question you should be asking. And sometimes rather than how do I defeat this enemy and how do I win this battle, a better question would be, how do I avoid this battle? How do I not get into the fight at all? Jesus, when he taught us to pray, he said, pray this. And he said, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And I wonder if there's a connection there, that delivering us from evil things, brokenness, the world, is connected to not being led into temptation. One of the hardest things about temptation is it's very tempting. I'm gonna take that line and put it on Instagram. But I mean, it's, what's the easiest way to overcome temptation? Not be tempted. And so Jesus says, don't even lead me to where at places that I'm tempted. Speaking of sexual sin, Paul says to the church in Corinth, he's talking to me, he says, you guys, there's a lot of sin out there that you're trying to fight. When it comes to sexual immorality, Paul says, flee from it, run away. The word flee means to like give up, quit, and run away from the battlefield, right? Flee from sexual immorality. It's like he's saying the best way to defeat this is to not even be near it in the first place. And I think there's a lot of habitual sins in our lives that we need to hear that and understand it. One of my first cars way back in the 90s, I lived in the Midwest where some of you are watching the Midwest, you still understand, but a lot of you are watching here in Southern California and you don't get this, but we had metal cars that got tons of salt on them and rusted all the time in the winter because we put a lot of salt on the road. And I remember when my car started rusting, it was an old 1983 Buick Riviera, this big, huge boat of a car, and started getting all this rust on the back. And I remember going to somebody and like, I want to cover it up. And he's like, well, you can take this, wire brush and scrape it off. And then here's some spray paint that matches the color of your car. And so I would scrape all the rust off and I'd spray it and like, oh, good, done. And then like 2 months later, it would come back more. And then I'd take that, and it just kept happening. Even places, the rust would come through the spray paint. And I remember getting very frustrated. Again, it felt like I was playing whack-a-mole. And I'm talking to a guy once, and I'm very new to all this. I'm probably 16 years old. And I think I came back for my second or third can of spray paint for that car. And I'm like, I just don't understand. How do I beat rust? And he kind of looks at me. He's like, you don't beat rust. What are you talking about? I'm like, well, how do I get rid of it? He's like, you don't get rid of it. The way to beat rust is to keep your car from rusting, is to constantly be washing the salt off. It's to keep it clean and keep the rust from. As soon as the rust is there, you've lost already. And I think for many of us, we're struggling with habitual sin patterns. Like, how do I beat this? I'm here at the bar and I don't want to drink, but I end up drinking anyway. And it's like, well, you've already lost the battle, because why are you at the bar? That there's something about before the temptation's even there, I need to make a decision. How do I keep the car from rusting rather than constantly trying to figure out how to get the rust off the car? How do I keep myself from situations that I keep falling into sin rather than trying to fight the sin as best as I can when I'm in the moment? I'm a big history guy. I love history, and I love military history too. It just interests me. And there's a very interesting dynamic in American military history, because America started with a war, the Revolutionary War against England, where we were this small ragtag group of, untrained, ill-equipped soldiers, outnumbered, outgunned, defeated the greatest army the world had ever known at the time. How? How did America beat the British? And the answer is probably complex, but I can give you one piece to the answer. One of the reasons why America was able to beat the British is because the British fought us on our terms, because America knew the ground. America knew where to hide. The colonialists knew when and how to best to meet them on their terms. You used to have this kind of warfare where the two armies would just line up across each other on a field and just start shooting at each other. Well, of course, the stronger army is going to win. But over time, the American colonialists started taking the fight more into the trees and other places and trying to pick the battlegrounds. And the British didn't know what to do with it. And we ended up winning the war. Well, then you fast forward to Vietnam, and it was like we had forgotten that. And somebody fought us, the most powerful military in the world, on their terms, and it didn't go well. And someone would argue we didn't learn that lesson even in Iraq as well. And I'm not getting that, but there's something about choosing the battleground. And when Jesus is talking to us about sin, it's almost like he's saying, choose the battleground. Don't go into the trees and then complain that you got shot from somebody hiding in the bushes, right? You're the stronger army. You have the Holy Spirit. Stand out on the plains and make him come to you. And what you'll realize is he won't. What you're fighting against sin sometimes, some sins, some sins. I'm not talking about, there are some sins in your life that are so ingrained and they're so powerful. That it's a stronghold even on our flesh and things, that it's not a winnable war. It's not an enemy that you soundly defeat and it's over. And once you don't shoot them and they're dead and that's the end of it. There's no end to it. I think especially some sexual sins, that as long as, if you're a guy, as long as there's testosterone in your body, it's an issue. But it doesn't mean it's not something you have to keep falling prey to. It's what battleground am I choosing to fight this on? Am I waiting until I'm feeling the temptation and struggling to then try to fight it? Or am I choosing the battleground? Am I figuring out how to keep the rust from ever starting? And that's a big deal. So I think when you, my first thing is pay attention to consequences, keep them in mind. The second thing is talk about it, be open about it. My third thing is what I would call preemptive holiness. Preemptive holiness. I didn't coin that word. I got that from somebody else. But it's about saying, what can I do now when I'm feeling strong and capable in order to keep me from falling into things later when I don't? And I think a good example is always, look at the sexual sin kind of issue. Rather than waiting until you're in the heat of the moment, literally, what decisions can you make now? If you're dating, what decisions can you make now about how you will or won't put yourselves in certain situations before you're married? If you're single, or maybe you're struggling with stuff on the internet, well, what barriers and guards are you putting on those things, like your phone, the internet? It's an old proverb that I made up. If you're allergic to bees, stop digging for honey. And some of us, we complain about the bee stings. I keep getting stung by bees. Why do you keep sticking your hand in the beehive? Well, because I like honey. Maybe there's maybe you need to set some boundaries to keep you from going near that. Maybe you need to give up honey. Maybe that bee sting is so problematic that you just need to live without something sweet in your life, because not having something sweet in your life might actually be better than the pain of those bee stings. I don't drink at all. I don't touch alcohol. I don't judge those of you that do. There's a sin. In my life, I had a problem in college and I had to cut it out. I got rid of it. And the one thing that you're never going to see happen with Pete Goodman is you're never going to see him drunk and stupid making dumb decisions, because he doesn't even touch it. It was just a decision I had to make. And I think there's some of you that need to make those kind of decisions in your life. You need to let the consequences, the weight of the consequences, lead you to make some tough decisions now. Maybe you just delete Instagram and you don't need it, and then you don't worry about struggling when you're on your phone. Oh, wow, amazing. But whatever the issue is, could you identify something preemptively that you could do now in order to keep that from becoming an issue down the road? I think that's so important. And again, I can't necessarily, I could sit here and here's a bunch of examples. I don't know what your example is. I don't know what your issue is. I could say, going back to the previous question about conspiracy theories, if one of your big struggles in life is you keep falling into these places of dark thoughts and anger and mistrust, I would say, I can't get over it. Well, what are you filling your mind with? Maybe it's time you turn off looking at all those websites and choose to look at positive things in general and see if different fruit comes about it. If you're super pessimistic and angry all the time, maybe watching 24-hour cable news isn't good for you. You need to turn it off. If you are someone who is constantly struggling to be content with your life and everything, you just constantly want something better, how much time are you spending looking at other people's lives and what they ate for breakfast on social media? Maybe you just need to cut it off, and you'll find your thought pattern starting to change. If there's a struggle with addiction, are there people in your life who hanging out with them often lead back to those places? Maybe it's just cutting those things out of your life in order to not end up in those kinds of places. Whatever it is, keep the consequences in view. Be open, talk about it, be transparent, and choose to preemptively go after it. Stop trying to defeat forever the battle, and instead see yourself every day needing to guard yourself against it, to flee from it, to put up boundaries, to put up walls around yourself maybe, and see if, and I know in my own life, that's the best way I've seen success. Okay. This ended up being kind of a heavy episode, but hopefully it was helpful, and I appreciate getting the chance to share some of this stuff with you. The purpose of this podcast isn't just to answer tough Bible questions. It is to think about wisdom and the way that God has called us to live differently. And so hopefully these questions actually have some real practical implications for how you find goodness in your life. And I'm praying that you would. If you heard anything and you want to talk more about it, you're just like, I'd love to just connect with that. Maybe you live in my area and you want to get lunch. Let's do it. You want to email me, talk to me. I'm available. finding somebody, maybe wherever church you go to, it's a pastor or a small group leader or someone, but open up, be willing to talk to people. That's the first step. And yeah, if you do want to reach out to me, you can find me my email at pete@risecitychurch.com. You can also find me on social media. My Instagram is the Like Stars Podcast, Like Stars Facebook, and on YouTube, it's at Like Stars Podcast. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to reach out. What thoughts do you have? Any questions or concerns or your own experiences that you want to comment on this and share with other people? Go ahead and leave them in the comment section. I'm sure other people would enjoy reading them. So how have you been able to overcome some of the habitual sins in your life? Or I don't know, what conspiracy theories do you think Pete Goodman actually should be afraid of? And I'm being too naive. That'd be a good one. All right, everyone, have a fantastic week, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Like Stars Podcast. Thanks. You consume me and I burn.